you. Miriam, we need to try and pick up the pace a little bit with the questioning.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned many of the duties of schools that Ofsted have a responsibility to inspect, but one of the duties of schools is to be politically impartial. And the Education Act forbids political indoctrination, makes sure that schools and teachers don't promote partisan views. The DfE was sufficiently concerned about this issue that they issued new guidance last year about how schools should approach contentious political issues. But I don't think there's any evidence that anything has changed, and certainly research from Policy Exchange suggests that a majority of children in British schools have been taught contentious political ideas, many of them as fact with no kind of alternative viewpoints presented. And I've even heard from parents whose children have been punished for not adhering to some of these political theories. So what experience do you have of kind of working with political neutrality in school, and whose responsibility do you think it is for enforcing this guidance, and how would you see Ofsted's role in that?
Well, thank you. Well, I was invited to be a part of the committee that advised the government on writing that guidance. I've taken political impartiality very seriously my entire life. I would challenge anyone to say that I've got a political view. I think as a teacher, your job is to not teach contested facts, but to teach secure knowledge based upon evidence, and to present a really balanced viewpoint to the children. So I think if you've got, I mean, I've never seen it, I have to say, in all the schools, not just my own 41, but I've worked in hundreds, I mean, possibly in thousands of schools that I've seen in my career. I've seen some individual mistakes from some teachers, but a good head teacher, good leaders, good governing bodies, responsible bodies will look at the curriculum that's being taught, will look at who's coming into school, who's speaking, will make sure that they've got those checks. I think when you've got external speakers, it is a moment of danger for schools, and I would encourage schools to go through a sense of risk assessment that you would if you were bringing children down to visit the Houses of Parliament. You would go through a series of risk assessment, how you're going to cross the road, what's going to happen. You should do those same level of risk assessment when you're bringing external visitors into schools to speak. And you should constantly look at your curriculum. Amanda Spearman is right. It's the substance of education, what is taught and how it is taught, that is the most important thing in schools. And so anyone who comes against those areas, then there are ways to challenge. I would encourage people to challenge the responsible bodies in those organisations, and then I would encourage them to challenge and to use the framework which is to come to Ofsted and to raise those concerns.
But there's a big difference, isn't there, between looking at the curriculum and determining that the curriculum is politically impartial, and then what is said and how it is said in the classroom. So, for example, there's a big difference between teaching about racism and teaching children to be tolerant, and then telling working class kids that they have white privilege, for example. There's a big difference between telling sixth formers that some people believe gender is on the spectrum and telling children that this girl is now a boy and you must call him him and he is going to use the boys' toilets. There's a big difference, isn't there, between what is written on paper and how teachers actually are behaving in the classroom. And again, the research suggests that around 80% of schools now have trans-identifying children, huge safeguarding issues with that. Headlines today after a report by Sex Matters saying that allowing boys in girls' toilets is potentially unlawful, and yet we know it's happening. So I think parents' frustration is, whose role is it to address this? You know, I'm in touch with some parents in Brighton who've had a child with trauma, who's been transitioned behind their back by the school, sent to a GP by the school, but they write to Ofsted, and Ofsted say, we'll keep it on file for the next inspection. But that's all very well, but what about the safeguarding issues created by these ideas right now? And whose role? I appreciate the government has a role in this, and we still don't have any guidance, but how can Ofsted make sure that children are safeguarded against what is becoming indoctrination in schools?
Well, I think it's really important that we do get the guidance, and I look forward to receiving the guidance as a school leader facing these difficult conversations all of the time. Schools are complex. If you take an average, well, not a large, say there's 1,800 children in the secondary school, if you've got a class size of 27, you're talking about hundreds of lessons a period. You're talking about 60-something thousand lessons a year that are taking place, that a head teacher has to be assured of the quality of the conversation that's taking place all of those times. These are great numbers, huge numbers. So having that guidance is massively important. And then I think Ofsted will need to look and reflect upon that guidance and to ask itself, if this is the guidance that schools, especially if it's statutory guidance that schools are adhering to, then what is Ofsted's role in looking at that? And I don't want to presuppose what that guidance is, but to say I think it is necessary, I think it would be welcomed by the sector and the system to provide clarity around some of those really difficult topics that you raise. But on the whole, I see schools treating children with respect and head teachers trying desperately to try and treat people with that fundamental British value of respect really carefully. I think most people will welcome the guidance when it comes out.
And do you think Ofsted has a role in making sure that schools adhere to that?
If it's statutory guidance, I think it is Ofsted's role to look at those areas. And if they get safeguarding concerns because people are doing something which is not keeping a child safe, then that is Ofsted's fundamental it's the fundamental number one job of any head teacher, let alone Ofsted. It's keeping children safe in education. It is your ultimate aim as a leader. You must keep children safe. Once they're safe and they're in the conditions to flourish, you must educate them to the best of your ability.
Yeah, okay. So just moving on to the teaching then of RSHE, because that's an area of the curriculum that I don't think is particularly much inspected by Ofsted. I understand that you have resource constraints and you will have resource constraints, and we understand from Amanda Spielman that if you're going to focus on maths and English, you can't necessarily look at every single resource used in RSHE. But again, we know it's been in the media. I've seen many of these materials myself, highly contentious, highly inappropriate. There's a panel right now, an independent panel looking into this to make recommendations to the Secretary of State. A number of MPs and parents are highly concerned about what's being taught in these lessons, but it's not on view. As the Chief Inspector at Ofsted, would you start to look at some of these resources when you go into schools, or is it an area that you just don't think is of concern?
Well, I would say that I find it difficult sitting here in the second day in September back in schools to imagine, if appointed, what I might do in January. So it's hard for me to commit to anything, and I think it'd be naive of me to commit Ofsted resource that far ahead before actually even starting in the role. But I do believe that thematic inspections where we think there are concerns is a really important area. So I'm really concerned about attendance. I think we should do a thematic inspection of all of that. If we have these genuine consolidated concerns across the whole system and they're not isolated, then I think that might well warrant a thematic inspection. And I'd look forward to having that conversation and looking at that evidence and seeing what needs to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And just on